I first met Sarah when she started taking organic chemistry in the fall of 1987. She and several of her friends would compete for top score on each exam. Soon after, she joined my research group and helped to synthesize epoxyenones, functional groups known to be present in the pancreas and believed to be involved in insulin release. And she studied their reactivity. She also did physical chemistry research with Dr. Cliff Thompson, where she remembers doing many viscosity measurements. She graduated from Missouri State in 1990 with a major in chemistry and a minor in biology, and she went on to earn a PhD in biochemistry from Vanderbilt in 1994, followed by a postdoctoral fellowship at Baylor College of Medicine. She has held faculty positions at Michigan State University and Virginia Commonwealth University, as well as the Baylor College of Medicine. And today, she is an associate professor of molecular and human genetics at Baylor College of Medicine, and she is also the director of the Biochemical Genetics Laboratory. Sarah's overall goal in her research is to understand the biochemical mechanisms and molecular pathways underlying human genetic disease. Her current work in her laboratory is focused on the genetic analysis of neurodevelopmental disorders complicated by obesity and circadian rhythm defects, and includes disorders involving autism, intellectual disability, seizures, and behavioral phenotypes. I have followed Sarah and her career since her graduation, and she is doing outstanding work. Please help me welcome Dr. Sarah Elsey back to our campus.
Great, thank you. It's really great to be back at Missouri State. Thank you, Dr. Yahnke, for that introduction, and it's been a really fun time. It's great to see all the changes and all the progress that's been made here on campus. Today, I'd like to tell you a little bit about genetic testing and about thinking about genetic testing and how it might affect your life, and genetics in general and how it is all around us. And so I hope to generate some discussion, and maybe we'll have some questions, time for some questions at the end. I'd like to tell you a little bit about Laura. This is Laura. She has a rare genetic disorder called Smith-Magenis syndrome. Laura is personable and kind and friendly, helpful person, and Laura has intellectual disability. Smith-Magenis syndrome is a complex neurodevelopmental disorder that involves intellectual disability, some growth and weight concerns. Most individuals do become obese by adulthood, and significant sleep disturbances and behavioral problems. And it's a genomic disorder that's caused by a deletion on chromosome 17. And this deletion typically includes many genes. Now, as you can imagine, the primary issues for this in this disorder and for families managing a child and adults who have this disability includes sleep disturbances and behavioral problems. And so the sleep disturbances are an extreme aspect of this disorder and really exemplify a sleep disturbance that is focused on abnormalities due to a single gene. My lab identified the gene that causes this disorder about 10 years ago, and so our focus has been trying to understand circadian rhythm and obesity and its relation to not only this disorder, but also to other public health concerns. And so individuals with Smith-Magenis syndrome have a different day-night pattern than most people. They have a melatonin pattern that peaks during the middle of the day, but melatonin peaks during the day and it's very low at night. And so they're unable to sleep at night, as melatonin helps us go to sleep and stay asleep, but yet they want to sleep during the day. And so for Laura, she takes medication at night to help her sleep. It helps her get to sleep and sleep for a little while, but typically she'll wake up at 3:30 in the morning and be ready for the day, okay? Now often, because she's already been up at 3:30 and she's had very little sleep, she's ready for a nap at 7 o'clock when it's time to go to school. Okay, so you can imagine some of these difficulties for families managing these kinds of disorders. And so this sleep disorder really affects mood and behavior substantially, okay? And it can affect it throughout the day. She may have sleep attacks, fall asleep right in the middle of doing an activity. temper tantrums, aggressive behaviors. You can imagine you might be a little bit grumpy when you don't get sleep, right? But this is a chronic sleep abnormality. And so another issue that is problematic is self-injury. And so individuals with this disorder have characteristic self-injurious behaviors that include nail yanking, which is called onychotillomania. There's a new science word for you. And skin picking and self-hitting. And so these are chronic management issues that need to be handled for individuals with this disorder every day. And so these behavioral challenges are truly caused by the missing genes. Okay, so there are these outbursts, temper tantrums, very difficult behaviors. And so it's really an excellent example of behaviors that are directly caused by a single gene. And so this is maybe an unusual situation. We think of genes as behaviors being a multifactorial and a complex developmental and environmental impacts that contribute to them. And that's true. But in this case, what we see is we've got a single gene that's causing this very complex disorder. And so we hope that by understanding disorders like Smith-Magenis syndrome, that we can understand rare disease. Okay? So by understanding a single disorder with a rare gene, or a gene that causes a rare disease that impacts circadian rhythm, growth and development, and leading to obesity. So sleep disturbance and obesity are very common in the population, right? So these are very common issues in the general population. But if we can understand how this gene functions, then we might have better insight into the function of, into the impact of these biochemical pathways on the general population. And so it's important to think that these, and understand that these rare diseases, and understanding these rare diseases can really positively impact and inform our understanding of biology and ultimately our health care. So 1 in 10 Americans, has a rare disease. So if you combine all of the rare diseases together, at least 1 in 10 Americans has one. So collectively, these are not rare concerns for us, right? So this is something that we always need to think about. And so you can think 30 million people in the US are impacted by rare disease at any given time, and globally it's a significant concern. And so about 80% of these rare diseases we know are caused by faulty genes. And typically 50% of these rare diseases, at least 50%, are directly impacting children. Okay? And so children early in their life, and it's going to impact them for the rest of their lives. Okay? And so why is understanding rare disease important to you, to me, to anyone? Why is this important? And it's important because these biological processes are common to all of us, right? And if we can understand how they work better, these processes work, and we understand the underlying physiology, then perhaps we can develop new medications, we can understand health in a more complete way, and provide a better quality of life for everybody. Okay? And so again, in my example for Smith-Magenis syndrome, understanding this gene involving circadian rhythm and sleep really can help us improve sleep medications and treatment for the broader population. And so in order to understand this and to think about rare disease a little more, I think it's important to understand genetics. And you say, well, what really is genetics? And why is this important to me? Because I think many of us might not think, rare disease, I don't have a rare disease, so why is this important? And I'd like to I hope today that you'll be thinking maybe we should discuss this more, and we should be thinking about this a little more, and also talking about it at home and with our families. And so, of course, genetics really is the key to biology. It's the science of heredity. It's how traits and disorders are ultimately passed from one generation to the next. And it includes the study of genes and genetic traits, genetic testing, expression of genes, any kind of disease risk, all kinds of issues. And it includes those ethical issues that surround genetic testing and how we handle those results. So, okay, it's not going, okay. And so I think we probably think most often of genetics as being just chromosomes and genes. And you say, well, what's the difference? Well, chromosomes are these structures that we see in the cells that are made of DNA and protein. And we think of that, but the genes really are within those chromosomes. And ultimately, we have sequencing now for most of the genes in the genome, and we understand at least the sequence, but we might not yet understand that function. And so that's really where research, of course, is going. And while we have the sequence, and if we, well, let me back up. If you think about genetics from a very simple perspective, you think about the genome. The genome is a word that is really becoming more popular to use instead of genetics, so you'll see genetics and genomics used interchangeably in the news and in the media. And if you think about a book as your genome, that's the book about you. That's everything that's contained about you is in your genomes. And then those chapters within those are chromosomes. And within those chapters, we've got sentences. And those sentences could be a gene. And so you can imagine that if you alter what that sentence says, then it's going to change the meaning of the book, okay? And it's going to change what's going on in there. And so we're trying to understand each of those changes and how those might contribute to differences in traits and differences in bodily function. Okay, so for example, if you change a single letter in a sentence in a word, that you now have what was a very simple sentence as the cow jumped over the moon. We change one letter, now we see that the cow jumped over the loon. Okay, and so it's a completely different meaning, right? And so this is what's going on in all of our genes. And some of those changes are maybe slight, and they may not impact the meaning substantially, but other changes are significant. And so everybody's heard of the Human Genome Project. This was completed officially in 2001, and so that gave us the basic sequence of most of the genetic sequence in the genome. Not all of it, but most of it. And so now, what we're really tasked with is understanding what all of it means. We have sequence, we have a bunch of letters strung together, and we're really trying to understand what all of those letters mean, and within the context of biology. And really, it wasn't until 1956 that we knew the correct chromosome number. So we've really come quite a long way. And so this has really changed since 2001. Now we're seeing genetics in the news every day. And so these are just some headlines that I pulled out just from the last couple of months. But if you Google genetics or DNA for news stories that are current, every day you're going to pull something up. And it might be something that relates to healthcare, or, and most of these here are related to healthcare, but it might be something related to healthcare, it could be crime, could be paternity, there are all kinds of possibilities. And so it's important to remember that this is happening all around us, and the genetics is really going forward, and much of our medical care now is really focused on understanding the genetics and informing patients and informing the community with regard to what those test results mean. And so again, you want to think, genetics is important, so you really can't ignore it because it is happening all around you. And I really hope that, well, a lot of what I'm going to do is today is going to talk about healthcare. I do want you to think about how genetics might influence other issues, whether it includes animal breeding or plant breeding as well, genetically modified organisms and with regard to foods or other sources of GMOs, and of course crime. This forensic analyses are all DNA based. And of course, ancestry. That's a new area that is really becoming more popular, and that's more of a hobby, for you to use your DNA to look at your ancestry. Okay, so these are some interesting approaches and thoughts about using genetics and DNA in our everyday lives. And so you might say, well, this is a lot of information. Where do we go from here, and what do I really need to know? How do we put all this information together? How do you keep current? And what do I need to know to move forward? And so it's incredibly important that we think about this information not just as individuals and how does this affect me, but you want to think about this as a family and think, because you know what, your genetics, you got that from mom and dad, right? So your genetics is their genetics, and your genetics is your child's genetics. So this information is important for your family. It's important for your close family and your immediate family, but also for your extended family as well. And so you want to think about that as a family and also as a consumer. I think whether you're purchasing a particular test, deciding with your physician if a test is appropriate for you, or if you're buying a genetically modified food, or if there are other concerns, whether there are forensics or ancestry or other interests that you have. And of course, it's really important to think about this with regard to legislation. Okay, so these kinds of topics are going to come up more and more, and if you're not informed, you're not going to be an informed voter, and so that's important too. And so to have really a basic understanding of genetics and appreciation for this complex entity, we want to remember, of course, that genes generally make us who we are, whether it has to do with height, or whether you can roll your tongue, or you have free earlobes or attached earlobes, or the color of your skin. And so some of these traits, of course, are really not modifiable. Unless you have a surgical intervention, most of these things are not modifiable. They're you, and they make you who you are, okay? So I think that it's important to think about some of these things from that context, realizing that some of these things we can't change, but some things are risks, not absolutes, okay? And so we can think about those kinds of things, about how we can modify them and use genetic information to our benefit. So you can think about all the different ways that you can modify your genetic risks, right? So we know from your family history if there's a history of cancer or heart disease or diabetes, some of these more complex disorders, and we know that we can modify risks based upon family history, right? So you can modify risks for skin cancer by reducing your sun exposure or wearing sunscreen. You can, of course, exercise and reduce risks for all of those disorders. You can modify your dietary intake. It's managing your environment is the key, right? And so that modifies your risk. It's not going to remove your risk, but it's going to modify it and hopefully reduce it. Okay. And so I want to point out that the importance of family history in this process. And so we all know that we have this, as I mentioned, this history, this family history. You know that if somebody in your family has a particular disease, or if somebody had a heart attack or a stroke or a particular kind of cancer. And so you want to think about family history and think about that information and how you can communicate that information to your physician and to other members of your family as well. And so And I wanted to take this from a simple approach, saying, in my family, we can look at traits. We can look at some simple traits and think about this. I don't have a pointer. The arrow points to me, okay? And so I have red hair and brown eyes. This is the example I'm giving you. So I'm looking at following traits in my family of red hair and brown eyes, or blue eyes. And so the brown and red circle represents me. Circles in a pedigree, this is a 3-generation pedigree, and circles in a pedigree represent females, squares represent males. And as you can see, my mother on the left has red hair and blue eyes. My father has brown eyes, but he had only a red beard, okay? And so we participated in some genetic testing, my mother and myself, to see if we could find what are the mutations that cause our red hair. And so we determined that through this testing that I'm actually homozygous for a mutation in the MC1R gene, which is a gene that's known to be associated with red hair. And my mother is actually a compound heterozygote, and with 2 different mutations, okay? And so, but you can see that individuals, we always think about eye color and hair color going along, and you can see that these are different in my family. And both of my daughters have red hair and brown eyes. Okay, so this is one way that we can follow this trait through the family and understand a little bit of the genetics behind it. But this is a very simple approach, and you can certainly do this in your family, and it might be fun and interesting. But of course, that's not going to really tell me too much about my health care. So it's important to remember that whether you're looking at traits or you're thinking about medical concerns in your family, that your medical history is your family history, and that your family medical history is your genetic history, okay? And it's going to give you your probable genetic risks by understanding that. And I'd like to encourage you to go to a website that's sponsored by the Department of Health and Human Services, and it's a family history tool. And through that family history tool, you can enter all the members of your family, and you can enter any kinds of medical concerns or risks that there may be, and you can generate a pedigree, and it will generate it for you. And this is free and easy to access. There are other free sites as well, but this one is very good and very easy to use. And so you can just Google family history tool, and that will pull up as an option. And so to do this, of course, you're going to need to talk to your family members. You're going to need to know what are their health concerns, because what you see on the outside may not be really what's going on. And that information may be important for you, for your health, and for your other family members' health. Okay, so it's important to communicate. And so this is another version of my family pedigree from my side, okay? And so the arrow again points to me. And I've drawn this pedigree with my siblings. I have 2 sisters and a brother, and my parents, and my siblings' children as well. And so I have some very basic healthcare issues that are associated with the members of my family. And so this information is important, and if you can keep this kind of information, you can just keep it on your computer as other issues come up and change throughout time. You can add this to your kind of master pedigree and keep track of all of the issues that are going on in your family. And I can tell you that your physicians are going to be really pleased if you bring this to them and say, this is my family history, okay? And this kind of information can be entered into your medical record and can be kept there and modified as appropriate. Now, some facilities do have pedigree and family history tools that are similar to this that will provide that information. And so it depends on the electronic health record of the facility where you go and where you obtain your health care. But this kind of information can be easily added to that medical record. Okay, and so this, you can then extend your pedigree of 2. I just want to show you some of the complexities, and the pedigrees can get really complex, and so, families aren't always so simple. And so again, here I am down here by the arrow, and this is my maternal side of my family and my paternal side over here. And so you can see that just through adding a few more generations adds quite a bit of complexity. Now, for healthcare purposes, the most important thing is going to be your 3-generation pedigree. So the immediate 3 generations is going to be the most important for you. Okay. So now there are some families that have some significant medical history and family history concerns. And so I'd like to illustrate some examples with regard to those kinds of concerns, just to give you an idea of what you might see in your pedigree when you start putting it together. The example I'd like to talk about here is called Huntington disease, and many of you may have heard of this disorder. It's an adult onset neurological condition that typically is identified and diagnosed somewhere between the ages of 35 and 50. And it's a significantly debilitating disorder. Death usually occurs 10 to 15 years after diagnosis. And so, however, while we think of this as an adult onset condition, it can affect individuals as young as 8 years of age. So there can be risks to children as well as young adults. And so individuals with this disorder will have gait abnormalities, chorea, loss of speech, and maybe some mild cognitive issues. And it does run in families as a dominant condition. And we know in this particular disorder, if you have the mutation, there is 100% chance you will have the disease. Okay, so this is often very difficult for families to manage, right? Because if they do the genetic testing and they're positive, they absolutely will develop the disease. There's no modification of risks associated with this disorder. And so in this family, you can see the individuals in blue are all affected by Huntington disease. Okay, and so any time that there is a child affected, that there is a parent that is also affected. Okay, this is a dominant condition, and you can see that families often can be very large because if you don't manifest symptoms of a disease until you're well into adulthood, then you've already had your children, right? And so there's a 50% chance that any child that you have, if you're affected by that disorder, that any child you have will also have that disorder. Okay. And so, as I mentioned, it's what adds to the difficulty with an adult onset disorder like Huntington disease is that by the time you're diagnosed, you've already had your children, okay? And Importantly, genetic testing is the most important and most accurate way for diagnosis for this particular disorder, and the most common way to diagnose. Now, with this disorder, what we found is that communication within families has certainly increased knowledge and increased use of testing, which has facilitated earlier diagnoses. And so individuals who are affected may choose not to have children. And if they don't have children, then of course that disorder stops with them, okay? And many individuals have also elected to have prenatal testing. And so they may have prenatal testing either in utero or of eggs, fertilized eggs prior to implantation. So and they select those embryos who do not carry the mutations. So there are many different approaches with regard to prenatal testing that can be taken. And of course, these kinds of decisions are incredibly difficult for families. And of course, too, not everybody wants to know if they're going to have disease, right? So some people just don't want to know. They'd like to just live their lives and live their life as it's planned and not worry about being tested or knowing that they have a diagnosis. And so sometimes that adds to some difficulty. So for example, if this individual in the pedigree decides he does not want to have testing, but one of his children decides, you know what, I'd like to know if I'm going to get this disorder. You know, dad's only 50. You know, he might still develop this disease. What's the chance that I might get the disorder? But dad doesn't want to know. Well, if the child is tested and the child's positive, then we know that dad's going to have the disorder, right? Because the child can only have gotten that disorder from his father. And so that adds a really difficult scenario for families. And so there are many families, you know, across the country today that are dealing with these kinds of decisions. And so just to illustrate this a little further, if an individual is positive for a mutation for this particular disorder, there's some issues that families go through and individuals go through, thinking about the fact that, of course, if you're positive, you're going to have that disorder, okay? And there is no treatment available. And so the positives are, of course, that you can have family planning and be thinking about prenatal testing or adoption or other options. And so there are some very positive approaches. You can plan your life a little bit differently. If you're negative for the mutation, then you know you're not going to get this disease, which has affected so many members of your family. Okay, so that, and you know that you're not going to pass that on to your children. Now, one thing that we do know is that in Huntington disease and in other disorders similar to this, is that there is evidence of survivor guilt. Okay, so these individuals are not affected, but perhaps their siblings are. And so this can be, of course, extremely difficult for some individuals. And so I'd like to read this quote from Alice Wexler in her book called Mapping Fate. And she was involved in the diagnosis and the identification of the Huntington disease gene. And what does absolutely seem absolutely clear is that testing for Huntington's is never innocuous. It is always a profoundly life-changing event, not only to the individual going through testing, but to his or her family, and to often wider circles as well. Gene testing in the case of Huntington disease can never be taken lightly, and it can never be routine. And so for individuals going through this testing, because this can be such a difficult disorder to manage, we have a process in genetics that we go through with every individual with regard to the testing and the counseling that's involved. And so this is not, it's not trivial, and so it's something that we take very, very seriously. And so, and of course, as you can imagine in this situation, not all testing results are negative and are bad news, okay? But sometimes there is bad news. And so what we do know is that what happens to people, and in this quote I think is a good example, is that we do know that what happens to people who get the worst news, they don't sink into despair or throw themselves off bridges. They handle it perfectly well. And most of us cope with some combination of denial, resignation, and religion, okay? And this is a quote by Steven Pinker, who's an author, and this is quite true. And we find that people, while it's very difficult to receive bad news, that people typically are very resilient. Okay. And so that's just one example. I'll offer a couple of other examples a little bit later. But Of course, with our advances, significant advances in technology over the last few years, and this has really allowed for much more cost-effective genetic testing. It's impacted the options that are available and the speed with which the work can be done, many different opportunities and options. And so and then this, of course, has been facilitated by not just advances in the specific technology, but use of robotics and higher speed instrumentation and an improved understanding of the biology, okay, which is an ongoing process. And so, but that said, the technology alone really is not sufficient. And really what we find is that genetic medicine requires just constant learning. Each day we understand more. We have, which allows us to modify outcomes. What we knew yesterday and what we might have reported yesterday with regard to genetic findings might be different today. And so it's an ongoing process. And so as a consumer, it's important to know the limitations of the testing that's available and what might be available in the future, okay? And so I would always encourage you to ask questions, and what's absolutely critical is that you provide accurate and complete information to your healthcare provider with regard to any information that you give them. And so as we think about genetics and its involvement in our healthcare, more and more to a greater degree, and you look in the news, and what you find is that there are lots of headlines, lots of discussion with regard to healthcare legislation and such that are associated with genetic medicine. And in particular, there's a term called precision medicine that's really used to describe targeted, personalized medicine to improve quality of care for the individual and to really have a disease-focused situation, or disease-focused treatment for a particular disorder. And this will become more and more frequent. I think you'll see this being used in your primary care physician's offices more frequently, that they will recommend genetic testing prior to use of certain drugs to decide which drug might be best for you. And so really the goal in this kind of testing is to find the error in the DNA that might be causing a problem, whether it's a problem that is specific to you or if it's a problem that's more commonly seen in the population. And then we, of course, want to identify the problem, which may be a biomarker that might help us more easily diagnose and more cheaply diagnose individuals with that particular issue, and then design therapeutics, typically a drug, that can then alleviate, fix, or possibly prevent that problem. And so that's ultimately the goal with precision medicine and with personalized medicine. And so this slide just illustrates this approach to diagnosis and treatment with regard to personalized medicine, thinking we're going to look at your DNA, we're going to look at your problems, and we're going to see if we can figure out the connection, and then try to target very specific therapeutics to alleviate your problem. Okay? And so now when you go to your physician, you're often asked, of course you're often asked about your medical history, you're asked if certain conditions might run in your family, and I hope that you'll think about this information and not be afraid to tell the physician everything and completely about what you know or don't know. And if you don't know history in a particular individual, that's as important as well. Okay? And so when we think about genomic medicine, and this is a great quote for us to think about how medicine is changing and how we maybe approach preventative medicine a little bit differently. So if we think about personal genomic medicine, it's not merely about saving lives. It's a more complicated, ambiguous story, one dating back to the start of technological time, so with the gradual replacement of luck with control. So think about this, you're replacing luck, that we're just going to see what happens with maybe I can control this just a little bit. And once upon a time, we were dealt a hand of fate, God, or the unreliable narrator, and the task of life was to deal with that hand. But now that task really is to improve the deal. Okay? And so that's really where we're going, hoping that we can improve healthcare, improve quality of life. Think about quality of life, and that's the most important issue. Now, I'd like to tell you briefly about another disorder called hereditary hemochromatosis. This disorder is incredibly common in the population, And it's an iron overload disorder. So it's very common in individuals of Northern European descent. And symptoms are pretty, nebulous. It's diabetes and fatigue, arthritis. Later in life, there may be liver disease, and sometimes cancer. Okay, so this is kind of this very nebulous description of constellation of features. And so the treatment really is to avoid supplemental iron, to avoid high iron containing foods, high iron laden water, basically to reduce your iron intake. And you can also do this by donating blood. So you can donate blood, which will help reduce the iron stores in your body. And so the manifestations that are most typically seen are more typically seen in men than women. Okay, menstruation keeps women protected at some level from this disorder, and so until they're postmenopausal, women are typically protected from features of this disorder. Now, importantly, about 10% of the U.S. population is a carrier of a mutation in this gene, so it's very, very common. Okay, but this is one disorder that you can modify your risk, right? So let's say you have the mutations that cause this disorder, but you can modify your environment and prevent yourself from having this genetic disease. And so again, this is my family pedigree, and I was involved in a screening program several years ago and offered the hereditary hemochromatosis testing to my mother and her sisters and my father. And what you can see here is that while I do not carry any mutations in this gene, I have the wild type sequence, as does my father and my husband. But my mother and one sister are heterozygous. Each of them carries one mutation, and one sister is homozygous for this disorder. Okay? Well, it turns out that aunt of mine has had some significantly elevated iron levels. Okay, and so it was clear that she could easily be manifesting disease. She also had very early onset arthritis, which may have been associated with this disorder. And so this information was very helpful to her. She was able to bring her iron levels down to a normal value and potentially reduce and prevent any risk for long-term complications related to this disorder. So this is just a good example of how genetic testing can help you prevent a disease. Okay? And so I'd like you to think about, when we think about genetic testing, you probably wonder, well, should I do it? Should I have this done? And, should I see a genetic counselor or a geneticist? And really, what is this genetic testing that I might do? Who's involved? And how do we decide what's done? And really, is it beneficial? And I think those are the questions that everybody wants to ask. And so generally, we think of individuals who really should be referred for genetic testing or a genetic evaluation to determine if testing is appropriate, as if you have a family history of specific disorders or diseases, because there may be an individual risk for you as an individual to be affected by that disorder, or for your children. And there may be prenatal risks that you might want to consider as well. Cancer is also, of course, has a significant genetic component, and so you want to think about your family history of cancer, or if you yourself do have cancer, okay, then a genetic evaluation might be appropriate. Pregnancy is also a time when we really have to consider lots of genetic testing options. There are many different options for pregnancy, either prior to pregnancy, or during the pregnancy as well. And so there's prenatal screening that can be done, as well as screening for that particular pregnancy. And so who would I say should really be referred, excuse me, who should be referred for genetic testing or genetic evaluation is, of course, going to be a person who has themselves a disorder, or if there is a family history of an inherited condition. And this could be anything from cystic fibrosis to cardiomyopathy, developmental delay in any children, there's muscular dystrophy, hemochromatosis, any of these disorders that are known genetic conditions. And of course, if you have a strong family history of cancer or heart disease, there may be questions about genetic testing and what might be available to you and what might be informative. Okay, and the testing for those particular groups of disorders are less absolute, but it really depends on what your family history is, and so that's why you need a geneticist in order to really evaluate clearly that risk to determine if there is testing that's appropriate. And of course, if you have family history of an individual diagnosed with a common condition at a very young age, like breast cancer under the age of 50. So anyone who has a relative with breast cancer under the age of 50 really should be referred to a geneticist for evaluation. And then of course too, there are other issues like ethnicity-based testing and things like that as well, because some disorders are more commonly observed in certain populations than others. We also want to consider referring individuals for evaluation if somebody's pregnant or considering pregnancy, because they may want to think about prenatal screening with regard to carrier testing or other diagnostic testing options. And so, for example, a woman who is pregnant or trying to get pregnant may have concerns about her family history or her partner's family history. Or if she has had 2 or more miscarriages, anyone who has had multiple miscarriages should be referred for genetic screening. And if there are any other genetic concerns or questions. So there are lots of reasons why someone might choose and feel the need to see a geneticist. And so in genetics, what we really believe and feel the primary goal in genetics is really to provide education and accurate information that the patient and family, so that the patient and family can make the best decisions for them. This information is considered to, we want to promote autonomy for the family and for the individuals, such that they feel any decisions that they make are voluntary. And of course, we want to respect any cultural and religious differences that there might be, and you can imagine that that can be very complicated. And of course, we want to ensure that there is privacy in this process, as well as really thinking of the primary principles of beneficence and non-maleficence, which means really to just do no harm. Okay, so we want to be helpful and appropriate for the patient and the family, and we want to encourage family communication in this process, because again, your genetics is your family. Okay, so that's again very important. And of course, everything that we do really offers fair and equal treatment in any of that process. And so these are kind of the basic ethical principles that we follow in genetics and genetic counseling. And I know that people often have fears of genetic testing, and so I really want you to think about genetic testing really as just another medical test, okay? I think you can think about cholesterol, right? We get cholesterol tested at least annually, some of us more often than that. And it used to be 25 years ago that you had to go to your physician had to order that test, you had to go to the laboratory and get the blood drawn, and this was a long process, and you might have to go back to the physician to get those results. But now you can actually get your cholesterol tested at a health fair, right? So without that physician involved. And so we've seen this progress in medical tests allowing the patient more autonomy, more choice in how they manage their health care. And I envision this happening more so with genetic testing over the next 10 years. I would envision that we're going to have much more freedom to choose. There are right now already a lot of companies that offer genetic testing online and that you can do for yourself. So there are many opportunities for this. And so I really do want you to think of genetic testing really as just another medical test, other piece of information that's going to help you determine what's best for your health care. Okay, and to provide information and education for your family. And so there are lots of different options for genetic testing. There's diagnostic, so if there is a particular disorder in your family, we can target that testing to be diagnostic to look for that disease and for the cause of that disease. And there's of course risk analysis for a known condition. So there's something that's running in your family and you want to know what's my risk, what's my child's risk. There are those that kind of information that we can share with you. And of course, prenatal testing, prenatal screening, carrier screening for common disorders, and prenatal testing for a known condition. So for example, if there's a couple that has had a child with a previous disorder that's very severe disease, then there would be prenatal testing available to determine if the child that they're carrying also has that disorder. And so which allows them some different options with regard to either termination of pregnancy or choosing to have that baby delivered in a hospital that might be more able to care for the child. So there are lots of different options with regard to prenatal testing. And there's also direct-to-consumer testing. As I mentioned, there are more opportunities online to submit a DNA sample for various types of testing. And so lots of different options with regard to ancestry, which of course is not really your health care, but it might be interesting in a hobby of sorts to see where your ancestry lies. And then you can also do carrier screening. So carrier screening is something that is available online. And then, of course, paternity. Paternity is something that we see commonly in the news, and we may think of it for ourselves in some situations. And so who's involved in this process? Well, it's going to be the patient, the physician, and your physician may be involved in there somewhere, and typically a geneticist or genetic counselor. And they're going to provide all of the education and information that you need and provide you additional resources for information for you to learn on your own as well. And then, of course, there's a genetic laboratory that actually doing the test and will provide the reporting for that testing process. And so where do you get the DNA? Well, there are different options. There's, let's see. Oh, it's not. Oh, there we go. Okay. And so blood, of course, is the most common choice. And so peripheral blood, typically from an arm, and usually requires just one tube of blood. You may have saliva. Okay, so if you're doing something from an online testing situation, then they're going to request saliva, and then a swab, which would isolate buccal cells from the inside of your cheek. And so these are typically the three most common sources of DNA for any kind of testing. And so again, this DNA testing is typically going to look at the sequence of your DNA with respect to the type of testing that you have chosen, okay? And this may be, whether this is healthcare related or if it's ancestry testing, the testing is effectively the same. It's just targeted to different regions of the genome. And so it's going to be, again, looking for those changes in the DNA that will help provide information with regard to a particular gene sequence, or with regard to population-based testing or heredity from ethnic populations. So it will give you lots of information with regard to that. And of course, those data are based upon what we know, and that information may change over time. And so I want to point out that there is certainly significant direct-to-consumer testing out there. And this may involve the paternity testing, or there are new websites. These are all current websites. There are companies that provide you testing with regard to managing your weight. I would say there's probably less confidence in the information that these particular companies provide. And so you want to be a good consumer, and you want to read about what they're offering and what they're doing before you send them a sample. And of course, there are other companies like 23andMe and AncestryDNA.com, that these are ancestry-related websites that will give you more of a historical perspective on your ancestors and potentially risks for genetic disease. And then there are others that will provide more broad-based information associated with nutrigenomics or other healthcare-related issues. So what I'd like to really put out there for you is to really think of yourself as a consumer, whether it's healthcare, whether it's for ancestry analysis, but be a smart consumer and understand the options that are out there, understand that there are limitations and that those limitations may change over time, and seek advice from experts. There are people around here that can provide answers. There are physicians that can provide answers, and of course, most importantly, talk to your family. So that's the most important source of information for you and for your health and for your family's health. Thank you. I'm happy to take any questions.
Yeah, so there are folks with microphones around, so if you've got a question, raise your hand and they'll come to you with a microphone, and Dr. Elsey is willing to answer your questions.
Okay. I'm not hearing it. Sit down.
Maybe now? Okay. So you had discussed those tests that you can buy. I've seen them at Walgreens. But then had discussed that quote that I loved about Huntington's disease, where this should be an intense decision about that sort of testing. So what kind of array is being tested, and are people truly informed about what sort of results those tests are going to get back?
That's a great question, and really the kinds of questions you should be asking. So the tests that you see at Walgreens or CVS or online are not going to offer you testing for Huntington's disease. Okay, so those tests, there are certain limitations with regard to tests that can be offered in that way that are direct to consumer. So that testing, so something with where there's a significant analysis, and it's also a difficult test, so it's not a straightforward test that's done for Huntington disease, it's a more complicated test. And testing for that disorder really requires a series of counseling sessions and the test process. So for severe disorders like Huntington's, you're not going to be able to get that done at Walgreens. Okay, so you're going to have to see a geneticist. So there are limitations with what's available from a direct-to-consumer option versus going to your physician. It's a great question. Yeah. Any questions? Oh, really? There are no other questions? Yes. Okay.
Can you talk about what the impact is of genetic testing on health insurance and, say, pre-existing conditions?
Okay, I didn't hear the last piece.
If something would be determined as a pre-existing condition.
Okay, yeah. So there is, I would say first that the issue with just regarding genetic insurance coverage for genetic testing is quite variable across all insurances. So some insurances readily pay for it and others do not. And so it's really going to depend on your individual coverage for that test. So what we can say, that Medicaid typically covers most genetic testing that's done, but especially for children that are impacted by genetic disorders. However, Medicare is more poorly covers that testing, and then individual private insurers are variable. So it's variable, and so you should ask. Now, what I can say is that most laboratories that do the testing, if insurance will not cover the cost, they will often give you a different price, okay, and help you facilitate that test option for you, okay? So that's important as well. Now, there is a legislation that is called the Genetic Non-Discrimination Act, okay, called GINA. And this particular legislation, which is a federal legislation that requires that there is no discrimination with regard to your genetic condition. And so these should not be called considered pre-existing conditions. I mean, obviously our genetics is all pre-existing, right? And so it's whether or not we've defined it specifically. So these particular disorders should not be considered pre-existing conditions. Okay. Yeah, that's a good question as well. It's important to seek that information with regard to your insurer to be sure that you're covered for that test, but to also know that there are other options as well. Yes.
How do decisions get made about what genetic information is considered a disorder?
That's a really great question. That information is really based upon research, okay? And so where individuals have been, typically the usual route is that you have an individual with either a particular medical condition or other abnormality, birth defect, or other situation. And then individuals with those, you look at the DNA of those individuals and you determine what possible gene is contributing to this. So typically for testing, these are going to be for genes that we know cause disease, okay? And we may have evidence that a particular mutation is causative. If there is a variant, what we would call a variant, in that gene that we're uncertain if that causes the disorder, we would say that, and you would get information that unfortunately is not a yes/no piece of information, and basically we call that a variant of unknown significance. And that variant is informative, and if you have a variant and you have the disorder that's associated with that variant, then it might be that variant is actually causative, but it requires additional information, additional study. And so in situations like that, in our laboratories, we would refer individuals to whoever is studying that and who is the top researcher in that area to see if they can provide more information and assistance to the family. So that's our usual route, is to certainly push it, to keep it an academic approach. And most families understand that and appreciate that there is someone studying that condition. Now, I think that there's another question, I think, in what you've asked, is that if you have certain variations, is that abnormal or normal, right? And that's another question. And I think, I think we all have our different opinions about what's normal or abnormal, right? And so that's a tough question to answer, and I don't think any of us can really give a good straight answer on that. And genetic difference is worldwide, and what's considered normal in some populations is not normal in others. So it's definitely cultural influences in that process. Yeah. Is there somebody else? Mm-hmm.
Hi. How do you see the future of genetic testing in regards to accessibility for low-income families?
For who?
Low-income families.
Yeah. Well, as I said, Medicaid does typically cover most testing, so that at least covers for the child. So that testing is available. I think for low-income families, there are, in many situations, not for all, but in many situations, there are foundations or other means of support that either the testing entities have available, or if there is an organization that supports that particular disorder, then that organization may help families find and fund that testing process. So there are many different things. You have to often be creative to get that done. But and the key is really working with your physician and the testing companies or academic institutions that might be doing the testing to work through that. Most labs will do a number of tests at no cost. We do, and it's, from my laboratory, it's at my discretion whether we charge for that test or not. We can do so many of those. So just to try to support the community. But I think for any healthcare, testing for any kind of healthcare for individuals who are less financially able is difficult.
I have a question right here. Mm-hmm. How has the Human Genome Project impacted our understanding of genetic disorders? And also, is there still more to be learned from the Human Genome Project?
Oh my gosh. So the Human Genome Project, really, the primary goal of that project was to sequence the genome. And so we have that sequence for most of the genome. Actually, there are still pieces of the genome that we don't know the full sequence of. But we don't understand necessarily how the genome works, right? And so we don't know the function of all the genes or the regulation of those genes. And it's very clear that there's still a lot of knowledge to be gained. And so now I think really where we're at is understanding what the sequence means, where we're going. No doubt that the Genome Project has facilitated the knowledge that we have with regard to genetic disorders. You can pick up a journal or a newspaper every day and find that there have been genes identified that cause disorders every day, okay, that we've been looking for years. So and that would not have happened at this pace if it hadn't been for the Genome Project. So the Genome Project also really facilitated the development of more technology and improving technology to do the process, to really make this happen. So it's not just the biology, but also the technology that's come out of it. So, yeah. Was there another question over there? Yeah.
Dr. Elsa, thank you for your talk today. You gave us examples of your pedigree and your discussions with your family. Many older generations aren't open to discussing some of those things.
Yeah.
So could you give us an example of maybe how to start those conversations with family?
That's a really, really good question. And it is a challenge. And it really needs to be a conversation. It really does. And it may need to be a gradual process to get all of that information. And of course, there may be, maybe not our parents, but maybe our grandparents that really didn't want to talk about, you didn't talk about any of your healthcare problems. And I guess, I think that people are perhaps more open to that now. And if you sit down and talk with them and talk about their issues and maybe approach it in a much more simplistic manner, that usually is helpful. And I can say that even with my own mother, who's generally been very open with any health concerns, that I think that what's been most informative is for me to ask some very specific questions, because I think she didn't think maybe that something that they had experienced was abnormal or unusual. And I think that's probably getting at the core, so when it's like when I had my children and I asked my mother, did you ever see this in any of us? And she would be, well, yeah, of course I saw it, I saw that and didn't think it was unusual. And so that information is really informative. And so I think part of it is your experience of what you know to be normal or not normal. And that may be, your experience may be different than that of your parents. And so asking about those kinds of questions in a different way may help draw out that information. It's difficult, there's no doubt about it. But I think it has to be an ongoing conversation. And if you start that sooner rather than later, it's going to be easier and more informative for everybody. Yeah. Any more questions? No more? Nope. Okay. Okay.
So one last question? All right,
Okay.
let's thank Dr. Elsie for her